New Mexico Territory, 1885. The desert stretched endlessly under a merciless sun, where survival meant making impossible choices, and where the difference between life and death often came down to a single act of mercy. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wagon wheels cut deep grooves in the red sand as Sarah Beth Williams urged her tired mule forward through the shimmering heat. 6 months pregnant and 3 days out from Santa Rosa, she pressed one hand against her swollen belly while gripping the reins with the other. The baby had been restless all morning, kicking with an urgency that matched her own mounting desperation. Her husband Samuel had been dead for 2 months now, shot down during a cattle dispute that had nothing to do with their small homestead. The bank had wasted no time in foreclosing on their property, leaving Sarah Beth with nothing but a mule, a rickety wagon, and the clothes on her back. The townspeople had whispered their sympathies while avoiding her eyes, as if her misfortune might be contagious. She was heading west to California, where her sister Martha had written promising work in the orange groves. But that letter was 4 months old, and California felt as distant as the moon. The desert between her and hope seemed determined to claim another victim. The sun had reached its peak when Sarah Beth spotted the dark shape ahead. At first, she thought it might be a dead animal, but as the wagon drew closer, she could make out the form of a man lying motionless beside what appeared to be the skeletal remains of a horse. Her first instinct was to keep moving. Lone women didn't stop for strangers in the desert, especially not pregnant ones with no protection except a rusty rifle that she barely knew how to use. But something made her pull the mule to a halt. Perhaps it was the way the man's arm was stretched toward a dried-up water hole, as if he'd been crawling toward salvation when his strength finally gave out. Or maybe it was the memory of her own desperation, the knowledge that she too was only a few bad decisions away from lying in the sand. The man was young, probably not much older than her own 24 years. His clothes were torn and sun-bleached, his lips cracked and bleeding. A battered hat lay a few feet away, and his boots were so worn that his toes showed through the leather. She could see his ribs through his tattered shirt, and his breathing was so shallow she had to lean close to be sure he was still alive. Sarah Beth looked around the empty landscape. There was no sign of other travelers, no indication of how long the man had been lying here. His horse was nothing but bones now, picked clean by vultures and desert scavengers. Whatever catastrophe had brought him to this point had happened days, maybe weeks ago. She knelt beside him, her belly making the movement awkward. His face was gaunt, cheekbones sharp as knife blades beneath skin burned dark by the sun. But beneath the dirt and exhaustion, she could see he'd once been handsome. His hands, though cracked and bleeding, showed the calluses of honest work. "Mister?" she called softly, touching his shoulder. "Can you hear me?" The man's eyelids fluttered, but didn't open. A soft moan escaped his lips, and she saw his tongue dart out to wet his cracked mouth. He was severely dehydrated, probably hadn't had water in days. Sarah Beth looked at her own water supply, 3 precious canteens that had to last her until the next settlement. She'd been rationing carefully, allowing herself only small sips when the thirst became unbearable. Sharing her water with a stranger could mean condemning herself and her unborn child to death. But as she looked at the dying man, she heard Samuel's voice in her memory. "A person's character ain't measured by what they do when it's easy, Sarah Beth. It's what they do when doing right might cost them everything." She unscrewed one of her canteens and carefully lifted the man's head, dribbling water onto his lips. He stirred immediately, his mouth opening like a flower seeking rain. She gave him tiny sips, knowing that too much too fast could be dangerous. His eyes opened briefly, pale blue, like winter sky, before closing again. "That's it," she murmured, supporting his head with one hand while continuing to give him water. "Just a little at a time." After several minutes, the man's breathing grew stronger. His eyes opened again and focused on her face with something approaching awareness. He tried to speak but only managed a hoarse croak. "Don't try to talk yet," Sarah Beth said. "You're in a bad way, but you're alive." She helped him sit up slowly, his body trembling with weakness. He was taller than she'd expected, even in his diminished state. His clothes told a story of hard travel: a brown leather vest over a torn cotton shirt, wool pants that had seen better days, and those sad boots that barely deserved the name. "Water," he finally managed to whisper. "I know," she said, giving him another careful sip, "but not too much at once. You'll make yourself sick." He nodded weakly, showing he understood. His eyes traveled to her pregnant belly, then to the wagon behind her. She could see him trying to process the situation: a pregnant woman, alone in the desert, stopping to help a dying stranger. "Names." "Cole," he said after another sip of water. "Cole Henderson." "Sarah Beth Williams," she replied. "And before you ask, yes, I know this probably isn't the smartest thing I've ever done." A ghost of a smile crossed his cracked lips. "Might be the smartest thing for me." As Cole grew stronger, Sarah Beth helped him into the wagon's shade. She wet a cloth and carefully cleaned the worst of the dirt from his face and hands. His story came out in fragments between sips of water and bites of the hardtack she shared with him. He'd been working a cattle drive from Texas to Colorado when Apache raiders had scattered the herd and killed most of the outfit. Cole had managed to escape on his horse, but they'd been pursued for days across an increasingly barren country. His horse had finally collapsed 3 days ago, and he'd been walking ever since, following what he thought was a trail to water. Turned out to be a mirage, he said with bitter humor. "Funny how the mind plays tricks when you're dying." Sarah Beth studied him as he spoke. Despite his condition, there was something solid about Cole Henderson. He didn't ask for pity or make excuses. He simply told his story and accepted whatever fate awaited him. "Where were you headed?" she asked. "Colorado originally. But now ... He gestured weakly at the empty desert. "Anywhere that ain't here, I suppose." Sarah Beth made a decision that surprised even her. "I'm going to California. Got a sister in Los Angeles who says there's work in the orange groves. If you can make yourself useful, you're welcome to travel with me." Cole stared at her in amazement. "Ma'am, you don't know me from Adam. I could be a murderer or a thief." "Could be," she agreed. "But murderers and thieves don't usually die of thirst trying to save their horses. Besides, I'm not exactly in a position to be choosy about traveling." Companions. The practical considerations were daunting. Her supplies were already stretched thin, and adding another person to the journey would mean even tighter rationing. But the desert was dangerous for anyone traveling alone, especially a pregnant woman. Cole, even in his weakened state, represented protection and help with the countless tasks of desert travel. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, they prepared to continue the journey. Cole was still weak, but he insisted on walking beside the wagon rather than riding. "That mule's carrying enough weight already," he said, glancing meaningfully at Sarah Beth's condition. They made slow progress through the afternoon, stopping frequently to rest and share water. Cole proved knowledgeable about desert travel, pointing out landmarks and suggesting routes that might lead to water. Despite his ordeal, he seemed to have retained his sense of direction and his practical skills. As they made camp that evening, beside a cluster of Joshua trees, Sarah Beth watched Cole work. He moved carefully, conserving his strength, but he was methodical and competent. He gathered dried wood for a fire, arranged stones for a windbreak, and helped her unload the wagon, with an efficiency that spoke of long experience on the trail. "You've done this before," she observed. "Been drifting for the better part of 10 years, Cole replied, coaxing flames from their small pile of kindling. "Since I was 16. Man learns to make do with whatever he's got." Over their meager dinner, Of beans and hardtack, Sarah Beth learned more about her unlikely traveling companion. Cole had been orphaned young and raised by his grandfather on a small ranch in eastern Texas. When the old man died, Cole had sold the property and taken to the trail, working cattle drives and odd jobs from Mexico to Montana. Never found a place that felt like staying, he admitted. Always figured I was meant to keep moving. And now? Sarah Beth asked. Cole looked out at the vast darkness beyond their small fire. Now I'm just grateful to be alive to keep moving. That night, as Sarah Beth lay in her bedroll listening to the desert sounds, she wondered if she'd made the right choice. Cole seemed decent enough, but appearances could be deceiving. She was trusting her life and her unborn child's life too. A man she'd known for less than a day, but when she woke in the morning to find that Cole had already rebuilt their fire and had coffee brewing, she felt a flicker of hope. He moved carefully, still recovering from his ordeal, but he worked without complaint or expectation of thanks. "Morning," he said simply, handing her a cup of the bitter brew. "Figured we should get an early start. Weather looks like it might turn." Sarah Beth looked at the eastern sky and saw the thin clouds Cole had noticed. In the desert, weather could change quickly and with deadly consequences. His ability to read such signs might prove invaluable. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. As they loaded the wagon and prepared for another day's journey, Sarah Beth felt the weight of their shared situation. They were two desperate people who had found each other in the vast emptiness, bound together by necessity and the thin hope that California might offer them both a chance at a new life. Neither of them could have imagined that their chance meeting would set in motion events that would transform not just their own lives, but the entire territory around them. Sometimes salvation comes in the most unexpected forms, and sometimes the person you save ends up being the one who saves you. The desert stretched ahead of them, still merciless and unforgiving. But now they faced it together, two souls united by the simple act of human kindness that had prevented one death and changed two destinies forever. The third day of their journey together brought challenges that tested both Sarah Beth's decision and Cole's resilience. They had reached the foothills of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, where the terrain grew more treacherous and water sources became increasingly scarce. Cole's strength was returning slowly, but he remained gaunt and moved with the careful deliberation of a man who had looked death in the face. It was mid-morning when they encountered the first sign of real trouble. A dust cloud on the horizon grew larger as they watched, resolving into a group of horsemen riding hard in their direction. Sarah Beth felt her stomach clench with fear, while Cole immediately began scanning the landscape for cover or defensive positions. "How many you count?" he asked quietly, his hand moving instinctively to where a gun belt would hang, though he had lost his weapons with his horse. "5, maybe 6, Sarah Beth replied, shading her eyes against the glare. "Could be trouble or could be nothing. Out here, it's usually trouble until proven otherwise," Cole said grimly. The riders approached with the confident swagger of men accustomed to taking what they wanted. Their leader was a thick-set man with a graying beard and cold eyes that immediately assessed Sarah Beth and Cole as potential victims. His clothes were better than his companions', suggesting he was either more successful at his trade or had taken more from his victims. "Well, well," the leader called out as his group surrounded the wagon. "What have we here?" "A lady and her protector traveling the old Apache trail." "Just passing through," Sarah Beth said, keeping her voice steady despite her racing heart. "We don't want any trouble." The bearded man laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "Trouble? Now why would you think we mean trouble? We're just concerned citizens, making sure folks are safe on these dangerous roads." His companions spread out in a loose circle, their intentions clear. These were road agents, the kind of men who preyed on isolated travelers. Sarah Beth had heard stories of such gangs, but had prayed to avoid encountering them. "Name's Briggs," the leader continued, dismounting and approaching the wagon. "And I'm thinking a pregnant lady like yourself shouldn't be traveling without proper protection. Lucky for you, we're prepared to offer our services." Cole stepped forward, placing himself between Briggs and Sarah Beth. Despite his weakened condition, he carried himself with a quiet authority that made the road agents pause. "Appreciate the offer," Cole said evenly, "but we're managing just fine on our own." Briggs studied Cole with the calculating gaze of a predator sizing up potential resistance. "You don't look like much of a protector, friend. Skinny as a rail. And probably couldn't fight off a jackrabbit in your condition." "Looks can be deceiving," Cole replied calmly. The tension ratcheted up another notch as Briggs' hand moved to rest on his gun butt. His men were similarly positioned, ready for violence. At a word from their leader, Sarah Beth realized they were moments away from a gunfight that Cole couldn't possibly win. Not in his current state, and certainly not against 6 armed men. But then something unexpected happened. One of the road agents, a younger man with nervous eyes, suddenly straightened in his saddle and stared hard at Cole. "Wait a minute," the young man said, his voice carrying a note of recognition. "I know you. You're Cole Henderson." Briggs frowned at his subordinate. "What are you talking about, Jake?" "He's Cole Henderson," Jake repeated, excitement creeping into his voice. "The same Cole Henderson who faced down Black Pete Morrison in Amarillo 2 years ago. Shot him clean through the heart when Morrison drew first." A murmur ran through the other road agents. Even in his diminished state, Cole's reputation had apparently preceded him. Sarah Beth looked at her traveling companion with new eyes, realizing there were depths to Cole Henderson that he hadn't revealed. "That's also the Cole Henderson who stopped the Jameson gang from robbing that bank in Pueblo," another of Briggs' men added. "Took on 4 of them single-handed and walked away without a scratch." Briggs' confident demeanor began to crack as his men continued to recount Cole's exploits. Stories of gunfights won, criminals brought to justice, and a reputation for being both fast and accurate with a pistol. The name Cole Henderson apparently carried weight in certain circles. "Even if he is this Henderson fellow," Briggs said, though with less conviction than before, "he's in no shape to fight. Look at him half dead from thirst and probably hasn't held a gun in weeks." Cole smiled thinly. "You're probably right about that, Briggs. I'm in no condition for a fair fight." He paused, letting the words sink in. "Good thing I never believed in fighting fair." The quiet menace in his voice was more effective than any show of bravado. Briggs found himself facing a man whose reputation suggested he was dangerous even under the best circumstances, and whose current desperation might make him utterly unpredictable. "Besides," Cole continued conversationally, "I'm not alone. And my companion here is carrying more than just a baby." Sarah Beth's hand had indeed moved to the rifle beside her on the wagon seat. Though she was no gunfighter, at close range even, an amateur could be deadly, especially if her target wasn't expecting resistance from a pregnant woman. The standoff stretched for long moments, with Briggs clearly weighing his options. His men were beginning to look nervous, their earlier confidence shaken by Cole's reputation and the possibility that this might not be the easy robbery they had anticipated. Finally, Briggs made his decision. "Well, Henderson, it seems like you've still got some teeth, even if they're a bit duller than they used to be." He stepped back toward his horse. "We'll be moving on. But you might want to consider that your reputation won't protect you forever, especially in your current condition." "Appreciate the advice," Cole replied mildly. The road agents mounted up and rode away, but not before Briggs called back, "See you around, Henderson. Next time you might not be so lucky." As the dust settled and the horsemen disappeared over a ridge, Sarah Beth felt her hands shaking with delayed reaction. She looked at Cole with a mixture of gratitude and wariness. "Is it true?" she asked. "What did they say about you?" Cole was quiet for a long moment, watching the empty horizon where the road agents had vanished. Some of it, he finally admitted. Those stories have a way of growing in the telling. Are you a gunfighter? The question came out more bluntly than she had intended. I'm a man who's been in some tough situations and lived to tell about it. Cole said carefully. That doesn't make me a gunfighter, just someone who's learned to survive. Sarah Beth studied his face, trying to reconcile the half-dead man she had rescued with the dangerous reputation that had just saved their lives. Why didn't you tell me? Because it doesn't matter who I used to be, Cole replied. What matters is who I am now, a man who owes his life to your kindness. They resumed their journey, but the encounter had changed the dynamic between them. Sarah Beth found herself stealing glances at Cole, trying to see signs of the dangerous man his reputation suggested. But he remained the same quiet, helpful companion who gathered wood for their fires and shared equally in their meager rations. As they made camp that evening beside a small spring they had been fortunate to find, Sarah Beth finally voiced the question that had been troubling her all day. Those stories they told about the gunfights and the criminals you brought in, were you a lawman? Cole was tending their fire, carefully adding dry branches to keep the flames steady. For a while, he said without looking up. Wore a badge in 3 different towns over the course of about 4 years. What happened? Why did you stop? Cole straightened and looked at her across the flames. Same thing that happens to most lawmen who stay at it too long. I got tired of killing people, even when they deserved it. The simple honesty of his answer struck Sarah Beth more than any elaborate explanation could have. She began to understand that Cole's wandering life might not have been a choice so much as an escape from a past that had become too heavy to bear. After a while, Cole continued, I realized I was good at something I didn't want to be good at. So I hung up the badge and took to the trail, figuring I'd find something else to do with my life. And did you? Find something else? Cole smiled ruefully. Been looking for 10 years, haven't found it yet. Over the next few days, as they traveled deeper into the mountains, Sarah Beth began to see glimpses of the man Cole had been. His knowledge of the country was extensive, gained through years of pursuing fugitives and tracking criminals across the wilderness. He could read sign like a book, find water where none seemed to exist, and navigate by stars with the precision of a ship's captain. More importantly, she began to understand the weight he carried. Cole Henderson had been a man who dealt in violence, even when that violence served justice. The toll of such a life showed in quiet moments when he thought she wasn't watching, the sadness in his eyes, a hesitation before speaking, as if he were constantly weighing the consequences of his words. But she also saw his gentleness. The way he helped her down from the wagon when her back ached. How he always served her food first, taking smaller portions for himself without comment. The careful way he handled their supplies, making sure nothing was wasted. One evening, as they camped beside a clear mountain stream, Sarah Beth made a discovery that surprised her. She had been washing their few dishes when she noticed Cole sitting on a boulder, sketching in a small notebook with a stub of pencil. What are you drawing? She asked, approaching quietly. Cole looked up, slightly embarrassed. Just the mountains. The way the light hits them this time of day. Sarah Beth looked at the sketch and was amazed by its quality. Cole had captured not just the outline of the peaks, but something of their majesty and peace. The lines were confident and skilled, showing an artistic talent she never would have suspected. This is beautiful, she said sincerely. You're really good at this. Used to draw a lot when I was a kid, Cole explained, closing the notebook. Self-consciously, my grandfather encouraged it. Said a man should have something peaceful to do with his hands. Why did you stop? Cole was quiet for a moment. Hard to find much beauty when your job is tracking down the worst humanity has to offer. Sarah Beth sat beside him on the boulder, her belly making the movement awkward. Maybe that's exactly when you need to find it most. Cole looked at her with something approaching wonder. How do you do that? Do what? See the good in things. After everything you've been through, losing your husband, losing your home, you still stop to help a dying stranger. You still look for the bright side. Sarah Beth was quiet for a moment, watching the sun paint the mountain peaks in shades of gold and crimson. I suppose it's because I have to, she said finally. This baby I'm carrying, it's going to need a mother who believes the world can be good, even when it's cruel. I can't afford to lose hope. Cole studied her profile in the fading light. You're a remarkable woman, Sarah Beth Williams. I'm just a woman trying to get by, she replied. Same as anyone. But Cole shook his head. No, you're not. Most people would have ridden past a dying man in the desert. You stopped. You shared your water when you barely had enough for yourself. That's not just getting by, that's choosing to be decent when it costs you something. As the stars emerged overhead, they sat together in comfortable silence. The harsh realities of their situation hadn't changed. They were still traveling through dangerous country with limited supplies, heading toward an uncertain future. But something had shifted between them. Trust was growing, built on shared hardships and small acts of kindness. Neither of them could have predicted that their partnership, forged in desperation and sustained by necessity, would soon be tested in ways that would reveal the true measure of their characters. The desert had brought them together, but it would be the choices they made in the days ahead that would determine not just their survival, but their transformation into something neither had imagined possible. The mountain pass they entered on their 8th day together presented challenges neither had anticipated. The narrow trail wound between towering cliff faces, forcing them to travel single file with the wagon wheels sometimes inches from precipitous drops. Cole walked ahead, testing the path and guiding the mule around the most treacherous sections, while Sarah Beth gripped the reins with white knuckles dotted. Was here, navigating a particularly narrow ledge, that disaster nearly struck. A loose rock gave way under the wagon's weight, and for a terrifying moment, the entire rig tilted toward the abyss. Sarah Beth cried out as she felt herself sliding toward the edge, her pregnant belly making it impossible to maintain her balance. Cole reacted with lightning speed that spoke of his years as a lawman. He lunged forward, grabbing the mule's bridle with one hand while throwing his full weight against the wagon's side. The vehicle teetered for an endless heartbeat before settling back onto solid ground with a crash that echoed off the canyon. "Walls! Don't move," Cole commanded, his voice tight with strain. "Let me check the wheels." Sarah Beth sat frozen, her heart hammering against her ribs as Cole carefully examined the wagon's undercarriage. One wheel had cracked, and the axle showed stress fractures that could prove catastrophic if they encountered more rough terrain. "How bad is it?" she asked, though his expression already provided the answer. "Bad enough," Cole replied grimly. "We need to find somewhere to make repairs, or we're not going much farther." They managed to nurse the damaged wagon another mile before finding a small clearing where a spring fed a grove of aspen trees. As Cole unhitched the mule and began assessing their options, Sarah Beth realized how completely she had come to depend on his expertise. Without him, she would never have navigated the mountain pass, and certainly couldn't repair a broken wagon wheel. "I can fashion a splint for the wheel," Cole said, examining a fallen tree branch. "Won't be pretty, but it might hold long enough to get us to the next settlement." As he worked, Sarah Beth watched his hands move with practiced precision. Despite the calluses and scars that spoke of a hard life, his fingers were surprisingly deft. She found herself remembering the sketch he had shown her, recognizing the same careful attention to detail in his repair work. "You're good at fixing things," she observed. Cole glanced up from his work. "Had to learn. When you're on your own, nobody else is going to solve your problems. Is that why you became a lawman? To solve problems?" Cole paused in his whittling, considering the question. "Started that way. Thought I could make things better, Bring some order to places where decent folks were afraid to walk the streets. He resumed working, his knife shaving thin curls from the branch. Took me a while to realize that some problems can't be fixed with a badge and a gun. What kind of problems? The kind that live inside people. Greed, hatred, the need to hurt others just because you can. Cole's voice carried the weight of bitter experience. You can lock up a killer, but you can't change what made him a killer in the first place. Sarah Beth was quiet for a moment, processing his words. So you gave up? I chose to stop adding to the violence, Cole corrected. There's a difference. As the afternoon wore on, Cole's makeshift repair took shape. He had fashioned a wooden splint that would reinforce the cracked wheel, bound in place with strips of leather cut from his worn vest. The work was slow and meticulous, requiring him to partially disassemble the wheel mechanism. You'll need to help me with this next part, he said, wiping sweat from his forehead. I need you to lift the wagon corner while I slide the splint into place. Sarah Beth struggled to her feet, her pregnancy making even simple movements awkward. I don't know if I can lift much in my condition. You don't have to lift it far, Cole assured her. Just enough to take the weight off the wheel for a moment. Working together, they managed to install the repair. Cole's guidance was patient and clear, and Sarah Beth found herself able to contribute more than she had expected. When they finished, the wagon looked decidedly jury-rigged, but the wheel turned smoothly. Think it'll hold? She asked. For a while, Cole replied. We'll need to take it slow and avoid rough ground when possible. That evening, as they camped beside the spring, Sarah Beth found herself studying Cole across their small fire. The man, who had been half dead from thirst just over a week ago, had regained much of his strength. His face had filled out slightly, losing some of the gaunt hunger that had marked him when she found him. But more than his physical recovery, she noticed changes in his demeanor. Can I ask you something personal? She said suddenly. Cole looked up from the coffee he was brewing. Shoot. When you were a lawman, did you ever kill anyone who didn't deserve it? The question hung in the air between them like smoke from their fire. Cole was quiet for so long that Sarah Beth began to think he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. There was a kid in Dodge City. Couldn't have been more than 16, but he was running with a gang of cattle rustlers. When we cornered them, shooting started. Cole stared into the flames, his face etched with old pain. The kid panicked, went for his gun. I shot him before I realized how young he was. Was he going to kill you? Probably. His gun was aimed right at my chest. Cole looked up at her. But he was scared, not evil. Maybe if I'd been faster, smarter, I could have found another way. Sarah Beth felt her heart ache for the man across from her. You can't save everyone, Cole. Sometimes there are no good choices. That's what I told myself for years, Cole replied. But after a while, the justification stopped working. I started seeing that kid's face in every mirror, hearing his voice in every windstorm. Is that why you really left law enforcement? Cole nodded. I realized I was becoming something I didn't want to be. Hard, cold, quick to solve problems with violence because it was easier than looking for alternatives. Sarah Beth leaned forward, her voice gentle but firm. The man I've been traveling with for the past week isn't hard or cold. He's kind, thoughtful, and gentle. Maybe leaving that life allowed you to become who you were meant to be. Cole met her eyes across the fire. You see things in people that they can't see in themselves. Or maybe I just see you clearly because I'm not looking at your past. I'm looking at who you are now. Their conversation was interrupted by a distant sound. That made Cole instantly alert. Horses moving fast through the darkness toward their camp. He was on his feet immediately, his hand instinctively reaching for weapons he didn't possess. Stay by the fire, he told Sarah Beth quietly. Act natural. The riders emerged from the darkness, 3 men on horseback, their faces hidden by the shadows beyond the firelight. But their posture and the way they sat their horses suggested trouble. "Evening, folks," called the leader, a tall man with a gravelly voice. "Mind if we water our horses at your spring?" "Help yourselves," Cole replied evenly, though Sarah Beth could hear the tension in his voice as the men dismounted and led their horses to the water. Sarah Beth got a better look at them. They were well armed and traveled light, the kind of men who lived by their guns. Their leader had the bearing of a professional gunfighter, while his companion showed the nervous energy of men accustomed to violence. "Nice evening for traveling," the leader commented, though his eyes never stopped moving, cataloging every detail of their camp. "Don't see many folks using this old trail anymore." "Seemed like the most direct route to California," Cole said. Carefully, the gunfighter smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "California, eh? Long way from here. Dangerous country between here and there." He paused meaningfully. "Good thing you folks have protection." Sarah Beth felt the familiar chill of barely concealed threat. These men were sizing them up, deciding whether they were worth robbing or killing. She reached casually for the rifle beside her bedroll. "Protection's overrated," Cole said with apparent nonchalance. "Most folks are decent enough if you treat them right." "Most folks, sure," the gunfighter agreed. "But there are always exceptions. Take my friend here." He gestured to one of his companions. "He's got a real unfriendly disposition, especially when he's been drinking." The designated unfriendly companion grinned, revealing broken teeth. His hand rested on his gun butt with practiced ease. The third man had circled around behind Cole, cutting off potential escape routes. "Thing is," the leader continued conversationally, "traveling costs money. Food, ammunition, supplies. Sometimes a man needs to supplement his funds, if you take my meaning." "I understand your situation," Cole replied. "But as you can see, we're not exactly wealthy travelers. Pregnant woman, broken down wagon, barely enough supplies to reach the next settlement." The gunfighter's eyes flicked to Sarah Beth's condition, then to their obviously meager possessions. For a moment, Sarah Beth hoped their poverty might save them. But then the leader's gaze fixed on something that made his expression change. "Well now," he said slowly, "that's interesting." He was staring at Cole's hands, where the firelight had revealed the distinctive calluses and scarring that marked a man who had spent years drawing and firing weapons. Professional recognition flickered in the gunfighter's eyes. "You know," he said conversationally, "you remind me of someone. Can't quite place it, but there's something familiar about you." Cole remained perfectly still, but Sarah Beth could sense the change in him. The relaxed posture was gone, replaced by the coiled readiness of a predator preparing to strike. "I get that a lot," Cole said quietly. "One of those faces, I guess." "Maybe," the gunfighter mused. "Or maybe you're someone I should know. Someone with a reputation." The tension ratcheted up another notch as the 3 men positioned themselves for optimal advantage. Sarah Beth realized they were moments away from violence, and despite Cole's skills, the odds were heavily against them. But then something unexpected happened. From the darkness beyond their camp came the sound of more horses, many more horses. The gunfighters froze as a large group of riders emerged into the firelight. "Evening, gentlemen," called a new voice, cultured and authoritative. "I hope we're not interrupting anything important." The newcomers were clearly different from the would-be robbers. Well-equipped, disciplined, and led by a man in a military-style coat who carried himself with natural authority. Sarah Beth counted at least 8 riders, all armed and alert. "Just watering our horses," the leader of the gunfighters said, but his confident demeanor had evaporated. "Excellent," the military man replied smoothly. "We'll do the same." Always nice to meet fellow travelers on these lonely roads. Faced with overwhelming odds, the 3 gunfighters had no choice but to mount up and ride away, their plans for easy robbery completely thwarted. As they disappeared into the darkness, Sarah Beth felt her legs go weak with relief. "Thank you," she called to their rescuers. The military man tipped his hat politely. "Think nothing of it, ma'am." "Major William Harrington, 5th Cavalry Regiment. We're on patrol in this area and saw your fire. Lucky timing, it would seem." As Major Harrington's patrol settled in to water their horses and rest, Sarah Beth caught Cole's eye across the fire. The gratitude in his expression told her that even a man with his reputation had recognized how close they had come to disaster. Later, after the cavalry patrol had moved on and they were alone again by their fire, Cole spoke quietly. "That was too close. If those soldiers hadn't come along." "But they did," Sarah Beth said firmly. "Sometimes help comes when you need it most." Cole looked at her with something approaching awe. "You still believe that? After everything that's happened?" "I have to," she replied. "Because the alternative is believing that we're alone in a world that doesn't care whether we live or die. And I refuse to believe that." Cole was quiet for a long moment. "You saved my life in that desert," he said finally. "But I think you might be saving something else too." "What's that?" "My faith that there's still some good left in the world." As they settled in for the night, both of them understood that something fundamental had shifted between them. Trust had deepened into something more complex and precious. They were no longer just two desperate people sharing a dangerous journey. They were becoming partners in a deeper sense, bound together by shared trials and mutual protection. The broken wagon wheel had been mended, but more importantly, two broken souls had begun the slow process of healing each other. 2 weeks into their journey, they reached the trading post at Cedar Ridge, a ramshackle collection of buildings perched on a mesa overlooking the Colorado River Valley. It was the first civilization they had encountered since leaving New Mexico, and Sarah Beth felt a mixture of relief and apprehension as they approached the weathered structures. The trading post was run by a grizzled mountain man named Ezra Hutchins, who emerged from the main building wiping his hands on a greasy apron. His eyes took in their battered wagon, exhausted mule, and travel-worn appearance with the practiced assessment of a man who had seen every kind of desperate traveler the frontier could produce. "Well now," Hutchins drawled, "you folks look like you've been through the ringer." "Come far." "New Mexico," Sarah Beth replied, climbing down from the wagon with Cole's assistance. Her pregnancy had progressed noticeably during their journey, and simple movements now required careful planning. "New Mexico to here?" Hutchins whistled low. "That's some hard traveling, especially for a lady in your condition. You got business in California or just running from something?" "Looking for a fresh start," Cole said simply, his tone discouraging further questions. Hutchins studied Cole with the shrewd eyes of a man who had survived decades on the frontier by reading people accurately. "You look familiar, friend. You been through these parts before?" "Might have," Cole replied noncommittally. The trading post offered basic supplies at inflated prices, but also something more valuable information about the trail ahead. As Sarah Beth rested in the shade of the porch, Cole spoke quietly with Hutchins about routes, water sources, and potential dangers. "Rivers running low this time of year," Hutchins explained, pointing to a hand-drawn map tacked to the wall. "You'll need to stock up on water here, 'cause the next reliable source is 3 days of hard riding." "What about the southern route?" Cole asked, studying the map. Hutchins shook his head grimly. "Apaches have been active down that way. Lost 2 wagon trains in the past month. You'd be better off sticking to the main trail, even if it is longer." As they prepared to purchase supplies, Sarah Beth overheard a conversation that made her blood run cold. 2 men at the far end of the porch were discussing recent events in the territory, their voices carrying clearly in the desert air. "Sheriff in Alamogordo is offering a $1,000 reward," one was saying, "for information leading to the capture of that outlaw gang that hit the bank." $1,000? His companion whistled. That's serious money. What did they take? Near 15,000 from what I heard. Killed 2 guards in the process. The first man lowered his voice conspiratorially. Word is, they're headed west toward California. Sheriff's got wanted posters going out to every settlement between here and Los Angeles. Sarah Beth felt her stomach clench with worry. $1,000 reward would attract every bounty hunter and treasure seeker in the territory. The trail to California would soon be crawling with armed men looking for easy money. She caught Cole's eye and saw that he had heard the conversation too. His expression was carefully neutral, but she could see the tension in his shoulders. A man with his reputation would inevitably attract suspicion, especially if bounty hunters were operating in the area. We should move on, Cole said quietly. When they had finished their business with Hutchins, the longer we stay in one place, the more attention we draw. As they loaded their new supplies into the wagon, Sarah Beth noticed Cole had purchased items beyond their basic needs: extra ammunition for her rifle, a sharp skinning knife, and a small bag of salt for preserving meat. Preparations for harder times ahead. You think we're going to run into those bounty hunters? She asked as they left Cedar Ridge behind. Probably, Cole replied matter-of-factly. Men like that cover a lot of ground when there's that kind of money involved. Are you worried they might mistake you for one of those bank robbers? Cole was quiet for a moment. It's not being mistaken that worries me. It's being recognized. Sarah Beth studied his profile as he walked beside the wagon. There's something you haven't told me, isn't there, about your past? There's a lot, one. Haven't told you, Cole admitted. But it doesn't change who I am now. Maybe not, but it might change how dangerous this journey becomes. Sarah Beth's voice carried a note of steel that surprised them both. If we're going to be partners in this, I need to know what we're up against. Cole stopped walking, forcing her to halt the wagon. He looked up at her with an expression that mixed admiration with reluctance. You're right, he said finally. You deserve to know. He took a deep breath. Before I hung up my badge, I was involved in taking down some fairly notorious outlaws. Made enemies of men who don't forgive or forget. What kind of men? The kind who put prices on people's heads. The kind who hire killers to settle old scores. Cole resumed walking, his pace deliberately steady. There might be people looking for me who have nothing to do with that bank robbery. Sarah Beth absorbed this information, feeling the weight of their situation settle more heavily on her shoulders. How many people? Hard to say. Could be none, could be several. Men like that ... they hold grudges for a long time. That evening, they camped in a hidden canyon Cole had spotted from the main trail. It was well concealed and offered multiple escape routes, the kind of defensive position a man learns to value when he has enemies. As Cole built their fire in a carefully chosen spot that wouldn't be visible from the trail, Sarah Beth watched him work. His movements were economical and purposeful, shaped by years of living with the constant possibility of danger. Can I ask you about your wife? Sarah Beth said suddenly. Cole froze in the act of adding kindling to the flames. What wife? You've never mentioned one, but most men your age have been married at some point. Especially men who understand how to be gentle with women. Cole finished building the fire before answering. There was someone, back in Kansas. The doctor's daughter is named Elizabeth. His voice carried old pain. We were planning to marry when I finished my term as sheriff. What happened? I happened, Cole said bitterly. Or rather, my reputation did. Elizabeth's father decided he didn't want his daughter married to a man who solved problems with violence. Sarah Beth felt her heart ache for him. Did you fight for her? How could I? Everything her father said was true. I was violent. I did solve problems by killing people. Cole stared into the flames. Elizabeth deserved better than a man with blood on his hands. Did she think so? Cole looked up at her, startled by the question. What do you mean? I mean, did Elizabeth herself think she deserved better, or was that decision made for her? Cole was quiet for a long moment. She said she loved me regardless. Sighed. My past didn't matter as long as I was willing to build a different future. But you didn't believe her. I couldn't risk destroying her life along with my own. Cole's voice was barely above a whisper. So I left Kansas without saying goodbye. Sarah Beth leaned forward, her eyes intense in the firelight. Cole Henderson, you are the most stubborn, self-sacrificing fool I've ever met. He blinked in surprise at her vehemence. I beg your pardon? You heard me. You found a woman who loved you enough to accept your past, and you threw it away because you decided what was best for her, without giving her a choice in the matter. I was protecting her. You were protecting yourself, Sarah Beth interrupted. From the possibility of being hurt, of being rejected, of having to change. She struggled to her feet, her pregnancy making the movement awkward, but her indignation giving her strength. That woman offered you redemption, and you were too scared to take it. Cole stared at her, his face a mixture of shock and dawning. Realization. You don't understand. I understand perfectly, Sarah Beth said firmly. I understand because I almost made the same mistake. What are you talking about? Sarah Beth walked to the edge of their small circle of firelight, her hands resting on her swollen belly. When Samuel died, people in town started treating me differently. Poor Sarah Beth, tragic Sarah Beth, burdened Sarah Beth. I started believing them. She turned back to face him. I almost convinced myself that this baby would be better off if I gave it up for adoption once we reached California. Told myself I was too young, too poor, too broken to be a proper mother. Cole's expression had shifted from defensive to attentive. What changed your mind? You did, Sarah Beth said simply. Watching you these past weeks, seeing how you take care of things, how you put others before yourself. It made me realize that love isn't about being perfect. It's about being willing to try. She sat back down beside the fire, her voice growing softer. This baby isn't going to have a perfect mother or an easy life. But it's going to have a mother who loves it enough to fight for it, to travel across a desert to give it a chance. Cole was staring at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. You're saying I should have fought for Elizabeth. I'm saying you should have let her fight for you, Sarah Beth replied. Just like you're letting me fight for this baby, for our future. The conversation was interrupted by a sound that made Cole instantly alert, the distant crack of a breaking branch, followed by the soft whinny of a horse. Someone was approaching their hidden camp. Cole moved swiftly but silently, banking the fire to reduce its glow while motioning for Sarah Beth to move deeper into the shadows. He had no weapons except the knife he had purchased at the trading post, but his body language showed he was prepared to use it if necessary. A voice called out from the darkness. Hello in the camp. I'm coming in peace-like. The man who emerged into their firelight was tall and lean, with prematurely gray hair and the weathered face of someone who had spent most of his life outdoors. He wore the dust-covered clothes of a long-distance rider, and his hands were carefully positioned away from the guns at his hip. Name's Jake Morrison, the stranger said, raising his hand slightly. I'm a federal marshal, and I'm tracking some dangerous men who might have passed this way. Cole stepped forward, placing himself between the marshal and Sarah Beth. What kind of men? Morrison's eyes flicked over Cole's face, and Sarah Beth saw recognition dawn in his expression. Well, I'll be damned. Cole Henderson, Marshal Morrison, Cole replied evenly. It's been a while. 3 years by my count. Since that business with the Dalton cousins in Oklahoma. Morrison's hand moved closer to his gun, though he didn't draw it. You've been a hard man to find, Henderson. Sarah Beth felt her heart racing as she realized the implications. A federal marshal looking for Cole could only mean one thing: he was wanted for something serious. Depends on whether someone's looking. Cole replied carefully. Morrison smiled, but it wasn't a friendly expression. "Oh, someone's definitely looking. Question is, are you going to come quietly, or do we need to do this the hard way?" The two men faced each other across the dying fire, years of history and unspoken threats hanging between them. Sarah Beth realized that everything they had built together over the past weeks was about to be tested in the most fundamental way possible. Cole's next words would determine not just his own fate, but the future of the woman and unborn child who had come to depend on him. "Suppose that depends," Cole said quietly, "on what exactly you think I've done." Morrison's smile widened, and Sarah Beth knew with sinking certainty that their journey was about to take a very dangerous turn. Marshal Morrison kept his hands visible, but ready as he studied Cole's face in the flickering firelight. The tension between the two men was palpable, years of professional history creating an undercurrent of mutual respect and wariness. "Before you answer," Morrison said carefully, "you should know that Judge Whitmore in Denver has issued a federal warrant for your arrest. Seems there's been some new evidence surface about that train robbery outside Pueblo 5 years back." Sarah Beth felt her blood turn to ice. A train robbery was serious federal crime, the kind that ended with a rope or decades in prison. She watched Cole's face, searching for signs of guilt or innocence, but his expression remained carefully neutral. "What kind of evidence?" Cole asked quietly. "Witness came forward last month. Claims he saw you meeting with the Hartwell gang the night before they hit that Denver and Rio Grande Express." Morrison shifted his weight slightly, a movement that brought his gun hand closer to his weapon. "Says you provided them with information about the train's schedule and cargo. Witness have a name?" Cole's voice was deadly calm. "Buck Carlisle. You remember Buck, don't you? Used to run with some unsavory types before he found religion." Sarah Beth saw something flicker across Cole's face, not guilt, but recognition and disgust. "Buck Carlisle is a known liar and thief. If he's your witness, Morrison, you're building your case on quicksand." "Maybe so," Morrison agreed. "But a federal judge seems to think his testimony's worth investigating. And that means you're coming back to Denver with me to answer some questions." "No," Sarah Beth said suddenly, the word torn from her throat before she could stop herself. Both men turned to look at her, and she realized she had just inserted herself into a potentially deadly confrontation. Morrison's eyebrows rose. "Ma'am, I don't believe we've been introduced." "Sarah Beth Williams," she said, struggling to her feet with as much dignity as her pregnant condition allowed. "And Cole Henderson has been traveling with me for the past 3 weeks. He couldn't have robbed any train 5 years ago because he was busy saving my life and helping me reach California." Morrison studied her with the calculating gaze of a lawman who had heard every kind of lie and alibi. "Ma'am, with all due respect, you're talking about something that happened 5 years ago, unless you've known Mr. Henderson for that long ... I'm talking about the kind of man he is," Sarah Beth interrupted, her voice gaining strength. "The kind of man who would share his last drop of water with a stranger, who would risk his life to protect a pregnant woman he barely knows. That's not the kind of man who robs trains." "Character references are touching," Morrison said dryly, "but they don't change facts. And the fact is, I have a federal warrant that says Cole Henderson needs to come with me." Cole stepped forward, his movement carefully controlled. "Morrison, you and I both know Buck Carlisle would sell his own mother for drinking money. If he's claiming I was involved with the Hartwell gang, it's because someone paid him to say it. Who would do that?" "Same people who've been trying to frame me for various crimes over the past 3 years," Cole replied grimly. "People who don't appreciate the work I did when I wore a badge." Morrison's expression shifted slightly, showing the first crack in his official demeanor. "You're talking about revenge." "I'm talking about men like Dutch Pemberton, whose operation I helped shut down in Tucson. Or the Morrison brothers, no relation to you, I assume, who swore they'd see me hang for putting them in Yuma prison." Cole's voice carried the weight of bitter experience. Men with long memories and enough money to buy false testimony. Sarah Beth watched the exchange with growing understanding. Cole wasn't just running from his past, he was being hunted by it. Enemies with resources and patience were systematically destroying his reputation and freedom. Even if that's true, Morrison said slowly, I still have to follow the warrant. Judge's orders. And if I resist? Morrison's hand moved closer to his gun. Then I'll have to take you dead instead of alive. Which would be a shame, because I always respected your work as a lawyer. The standoff stretched between them, two professionals who understood the rules of their deadly game. Sarah Beth realized she was witnessing the moment when Cole would have to choose between his freedom and violence, the very choice that had driven him from law enforcement in the first place. But before either man could make a move, the decision was taken from them. The sound of multiple horses approaching at speed echoed through the canyon, accompanied by the jingle of spurs and equipment. Lots of riders moving fast and purposefully. Expecting company? Morrison asked tersely, his gun now half drawn. No, Cole replied, but he had moved to put himself between Sarah Beth and the approaching sounds. The riders who poured into their camp weren't lawmen or bounty hunters. They were something worse, outlaws with the hard faces and casual violence of men who lived outside any law. Their leader was a tall man with cold eyes and a carefully groomed beard that did nothing to soften his cruel features. Well, the outlaw leader drawled, surveying the scene with obvious amusement. A federal marshal, a famous ex-lawman, and a pregnant lady. Feels like Christmas morning. Morrison had his gun fully drawn now, but 6 armed men had him at a severe disadvantage. Who are you men? What do you want? Name's Dutch Pemberton, the leader replied with a mocking smile. And what I want is sitting right there by your fire. Cole's face went pale with recognition and something approaching despair. Dutch, I heard you were still in Yuma. Got out 6 months ago, Pemberton said conversationally. Amazing what a good lawyer and some conveniently disappeared evidence can accomplish. First thing I did was start looking for the man who put me there. Sarah Beth felt her world tilting on its axis. This was one of Cole's enemies, the kind of man who would pursue revenge across any distance through any hardship. And now they were trapped in a canyon with nowhere to run. The lady and the marshal have nothing to do with our business, Cole said carefully. Let them go. Pemberton laughed, a sound devoid of humor. Oh, but they do, Henderson. See, I've been tracking you for months, learning about your new life, your new ... companions. His gaze flicked to Sarah Beth with obvious menace. Amazing how much more cooperative a man becomes when he has something to lose. Morrison stepped forward, his badge gleaming in the firelight. Pemberton, I'm placing you and your men under federal arrest. Drop your weapons. Marshal, Pemberton said with exaggerated patience, you're outnumbered 6-1. This isn't the time for heroics. It's always time to uphold the law. Pemberton's expression hardened. Then you can die upholding it. The canyon erupted into violence with shocking suddenness. Morrison got off 2 shots before Pemberton's men cut him down, the federal marshal's body crumpling to the ground beside their fire. Sarah Beth screamed, the sound echoing off the canyon walls. Cole moved with the lightning reflexes that had kept him alive through years of dangerous work, diving behind the wagon while drawing the knife he had purchased at the trading post. It was pitifully inadequate against 6 armed men, but it was all he had. Now then, Pemberton said calmly, as if he hadn't just ordered the murder of a federal officer. We can do this easy or hard, Henderson. Your choice. What do you want? Cole called from behind the wagon. Justice, Pemberton replied. You cost me 3 years of my life in that hellhole prison. Seems only fair that I cost you something in return. Sarah Beth found herself caught in the open, her pregnant condition making it impossible to find adequate cover. One of Pemberton's men had moved to flank the wagon, cutting off Cole's escape route. "The way I see it," Pemberton continued, "you got two choices. Come out peaceful-like, and the lady lives long enough to birth that baby before I kill her. Or make me come get you, and I start hurting her right now." Sarah Beth saw Cole's face appear at the edge of the wagon, his expression tortured. She realized he was about to surrender to save her life, throwing away any chance of escape or survival. "Don't you dare," she called to him, her voice fierce despite her terror. "Don't you dare give up. That baby deserves a father, even if it's not yours by blood." Cole's eyes widened at her words, understanding flooding his features. Sarah Beth had just revealed something she had been holding back, her growing feelings. For him, her hope that their partnership might become something more permanent. "Touching," Pemberton sneered. "But it doesn't change anything. You got 10 seconds to decide, Henderson." But before Cole could respond, salvation came from an unexpected source. A rifle shot cracked from the canyon rim high above them, and one of Pemberton's men pitched from his saddle with a cry of pain. Then another shot, and another, as hidden marksmen opened fire from the rocks above. "Take cover," Pemberton shouted, but his men were caught in the open. Easy targets for the shooters who commanded the high ground dot in the chaos that followed. Sarah Beth saw Cole break from cover, not fleeing but moving toward her with desperate determination. A bullet kicked up sand near his feet, but he kept coming, driven by something stronger than self-preservation. He reached her just as Pemberton, realizing his ambush had become a trap, began shouting orders for retreat. The outlaw leader's eyes met Cole's across the firelit chaos, and Sarah Beth saw a promise of future violence pass between them. "This isn't over, Henderson," Pemberton called as he and his surviving men fled into the darkness. "I'll find you again." As the gunfire faded and the sound of retreating horses echoed through the canyon, Sarah Beth found herself in Cole's arms, both of them shaking with reaction and relief. The mysterious shooters on the canyon rim revealed themselves to be a cavalry patrol that had been tracking Pemberton's gang for days. "Thank God you came when you did," Sarah Beth gasped to the cavalry captain who climbed down to check on them. "We've been hunting Pemberton since he broke out of Yuma," the captain explained. "Been tracking his gang across 3 territories. You folks just happened to be in the right place at the right time." As they tended to Marshal Morrison's body and surveyed the aftermath of the gunfight, Sarah Beth realized their journey had taken a turn that neither of them had anticipated. Cole's past hadn't just caught up with them, it had nearly destroyed them both. But they had survived, and in surviving, they had discovered something about themselves and each other that would change everything that came after. "What happens now?" Sarah Beth asked Cole as they prepared to leave the canyon under cavalry escort. Cole looked at her with an expression that mixed love, determination, and something that might have been hope. "Now we find out if the future can be stronger than the past." The canyon that had nearly become their grave was left behind as they moved toward an uncertain dawn. But for the first time since their journey began, they moved toward it together in every sense that mattered. The cavalry escort brought them to Fort Sumner 3 days after the canyon firefight, but the safety of military walls couldn't erase what had happened. Sarah Beth sat in the post-surgeon's quarters, having her minor injuries tended while Cole spoke with Colonel Bradley in the commanding officer's office. Through the thin walls, she could hear fragments of their conversation, words like federal warrant, false testimony, and protective custody. Dr. Amanda Reeves, the fort's civilian physician and one of the few women Sarah Beth had encountered since leaving New Mexico, examined her with professional thoroughness. She was a stern-faced woman in her 40s who had come west to serve military families and found herself treating everyone from soldiers to settlers to Apache prisoners. "Your baby is fine," Dr. Reeves announced, cleaning her hands in a basin. "Strong heartbeat, proper positioning. But you're showing signs of severe stress and exhaustion. How long have you been traveling? 3 weeks, Sarah Beth replied. We're heading to California. In your condition? Dr. Reeves frowned. You should be resting, not crossing hostile territory in a wagon. Sometimes you don't get to choose when life forces you to move, Sarah Beth said quietly. Dr. Reeves studied her with sharp eyes. The man you're traveling with, is he the father? No, Sarah Beth replied, then added more softly, but I wish he was. The doctor's expression softened slightly. Frontier life makes for unusual partnerships. I've seen women in worse situations. Make it work, she paused. But you need to know that if you keep traveling at this pace, you risk losing the baby. Sarah Beth felt her world tilt. How much time do I have? If you rest here for a week, eat proper food, get decent sleep, you might be able to travel slowly for another month. But no more hard riding, no more sleeping on the ground. Dr. Reeves's voice was firm. That baby is coming whether you're ready or not, and you need to be somewhere safe when it does. When Sarah Beth emerged from the medical quarters, she found Cole waiting on the porch, his face etched with worry and something else, a new kind of determination that she hadn't seen before. What did the colonel say? She asked. The federal warrant is real, but it's built on Buck Carlisle's testimony. The colonel's sending a telegram to Denver requesting an investigation into Carlisle's credibility. Cole helped her sit on a bench. His touch gentle but distracted, could take weeks to resolve. And Pemberton? Still out there. The cavalry patrol wounded 2 of his men, but he escaped with the rest. Cole's jaw tightened. He won't give up, men like Dutch. They don't know how to let go of a grudge. Sarah Beth took his hand, feeling the calluses and scars that told the story of his hard life. Cole, Dr. Reeves says I can't keep traveling like we have been. The baby, I know, Cole interrupted quietly. I talked to her before she examined you. She told me what the risks are. They sat in silence for a moment, watching soldiers go about their duties in the fort's dusty courtyard. Sarah Beth realized they had reached a crossroads that would determine not just their immediate future, but everything that came after. So what do we do? She asked. Cole was quiet for a long time, his eyes fixed on something beyond the fort's walls. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a resolve that surprised her. We stop running, he said simply. What do you mean? Cole turned to face her fully, and Sarah Beth saw something in his expression that took her breath away. It was love, but more than that, it was commitment, the kind of absolute dedication that transforms a man's entire purpose. I mean, we make a stand, here now together. His hand tightened on hers. I'm tired of letting the past chase us. Tired of letting other people decide our future. Cole, you could go to prison, or worse. I could, he agreed. But running hasn't kept us safe, has it? Pemberton found us anyway. The warrant followed us across 3 territories. He stood, pulling her gently to her feet. Sarah Beth, I want to ask you something, and I need you to think carefully before you answer. Her heart began racing as she saw him drop to one knee beside the bench, his hand still holding hers. I know I'm not the man you plan to spend your life with. I know I've got more enemies than friends and a past that could destroy any chance of a peaceful future. His voice was steady but filled with emotion. But I love you. I love the baby you're carrying as if it were my own. And I want to fight for the right to protect you both. Sarah Beth felt tears streaming down her face. Cole ... double quotes, will you marry? And me, Sarah Beth Williams? Will you let me be the man who stands between you and whatever the world throws at us? The proposal was so unexpected, so completely at odds with their desperate circumstances, that Sarah Beth almost laughed. Here they were, surrounded by military guards, pursued by outlaws and federal marshals, uncertain whether they would live to see California, and Cole Henderson was asking her to marry him. Yes, she whispered, and then louder, yes, of course. Yes. Cole surged to his feet and kissed her with a passion that made her forget about their troubles, about the uncertain future, about everything except the man in her arms and the love that had grown between them in the most unlikely circumstances. Their kiss was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses, not soldiers this time, but civilians. A small group of riders had arrived at the fort, led by a man in expensive suit who carried himself with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "That's District Attorney Harrison from Santa Fe," Cole said grimly, recognizing the lead rider. "This can't be good news." Colonel Bradley emerged from his office and approached the group, his expression carefully neutral. "Gentlemen, what brings you to Fort Sumner?" "We're here for Cole Henderson," Harrison announced, dismounting from his horse. "I have additional charges to file in the matter of the Denver train robbery." Sarah Beth felt her heart sink as Harrison produced an official-looking document. New evidence has come to light, including testimony from multiple witnesses placing Mr. Henderson at the scene of the crime. "More witnesses like Buck Carlisle?" Cole asked sardonically. Harrison's expression hardened. "Credible witnesses, Mr. Henderson, including a former member of the Hartwell gang who has agreed to testify in exchange for immunity." "Let me guess," Cole said. "Someone recently paroled from Yuma prison? Someone who might have had extensive conversations with Dutch Pemberton?" The slight flicker in Harrison's eyes told Sarah Beth that Cole had guessed correctly. Pemberton wasn't just hunting them physically, he was systematically destroying Cole's legal options, building a case that would ensure his enemy faced the gallows regardless of the truth. But before Harrison could respond, another voice cut through the tension. "I'm afraid you'll have to wait your turn, District Attorney." Everyone turned to see a new arrival, a tall, distinguished man in travel clothes who carried himself with quiet authority. Colonel Bradley straightened to attention. "Judge Morrison," the colonel said with obvious respect. "We weren't expecting you. Federal business, Colonel. I'm here to personally investigate the charges against Mr. Henderson." Judge Morrison's gaze swept over the assembled group before settling on Cole. "I've been reviewing the case files, and I have some serious concerns about the quality of evidence being presented." Harrison's confident demeanor began to crack. "Your Honor, I wasn't aware the federal court was taking direct interest in this matter. When a former federal officer is being charged with major crimes, based on testimony from known criminals, the court takes a very direct interest indeed." Judge Morrison's voice carried the weight of absolute authority, especially when those criminals have obvious motives for revenge. The judge turned to Cole. "Mr. Henderson, I understand you've been having some difficulties with Dutch Pemberton." "You could say that," Cole replied carefully. "What you may not know is that Pemberton has been systematically bribing and threatening witnesses in multiple jurisdictions, building false cases against several former lawmen who were involved in his capture." Judge Morrison's expression was grim. "You're not his only target." Sarah Beth felt a surge of hope. If the judge was aware of Pemberton's campaign of revenge, maybe Cole could finally get justice instead of persecution. "Your Honor," Harrison interjected, "regardless of Mr. Pemberton's activities, we have sworn testimony from criminals seeking immunity or reduced sentences." Judge Morrison cut him off. "Testimony that contradicts established facts and timelines." He pulled out a folder from his saddlebags. "For instance, the train robbery occurred on March 15, 1880. Mr. Henderson was in federal custody on that date, helping to testify in the trial of the Baxter gang in Denver." The silence that followed was deafening. Harrison's face went pale as he realized his carefully constructed case was falling apart. "Furthermore," the judge continued, "I have evidence that Buck Carlisle and the other witnesses were paid substantial sums by intermediaries connected to Dutch Pemberton." "This isn't a criminal case, gentlemen. It's an elaborate revenge scheme." Cole stepped forward. "Your Honor, what does this mean for the federal warrant?" "It means the warrant is hereby dismissed," Judge Morrison declared. And it means that Dutch Pemberton and his associates are now wanted for conspiracy, perjury, and the murder of Federal Marshal Morrison. Sarah Beth felt her knees go weak with relief. The legal nightmare that had been hanging over them was dissolving, replaced by something she had almost stopped believing in: justice. But Judge Morrison wasn't finished. However, Mr. Henderson, this doesn't resolve your immediate problem. Pemberton is still out there, still dangerous, still committed to destroying you by any means necessary. What do you suggest? Cole asked. I suggest you do what you do best, the judge replied with a slight smile. I'm offering you a position as a federal officer, with full authority to pursue Pemberton and his gang. It's time to stop running and start fighting back. The offer hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah Beth watched Cole's face, seeing him wrestle with the implications. Taking the badge would mean returning to the violent life he had tried to leave behind, but it would also mean having the law on his side instead of against him. I'm not the same man I was, Cole said quietly. I won't be the kind of lawman who shoots first and asks questions later. I'm not asking you to be, Judge Morrison replied. I'm asking you to be the kind of lawman the frontier needs, one who understands that justice is more important than vengeance. Cole looked at Sarah Beth, his eyes asking for her opinion. She saw in his face the man she had fallen in love with, strong, principled, but tempered by experience and loss. Take the badge, she said firmly, but take it for the right reasons. Not for revenge, but for justice. Not to be the man you were, but to be the man you've become. Cole nodded slowly, understanding his features. All right, Your Honor. I'll take the appointment, but I have conditions. Name them. First, I want protection for Sarah Beth and our child. Whatever this costs me, they don't pay the price. Agreed. Second, when Pemberton is captured, he gets a fair trial. No frontier justice, no lynch mob. He answers to the law, not to my personal grievances. Judge Morrison smiled with genuine approval. Mr. Henderson, you've just proven why you're exactly the kind of officer the Federal Service needs. As Cole stepped forward to receive his new badge, Sarah Beth felt a transformation taking place that went beyond official appointments or legal ceremonies. The man she had rescued in the desert was finally becoming the man he was meant to be, not despite his past, but because of how he had chosen to grow beyond it. The broken wagon wheel had been mended weeks ago. But now something far more important was being repaired. Cole Henderson's faith in himself and in the possibility of a future, built on something other than violence and regret. As the sun set over Fort Sumner, Sarah Beth watched her husband-to-be pin on his federal badge and realized that sometimes the most unlikely journeys lead to the most extraordinary destinations. 6 weeks later, the small church in Tucson was filled with an unlikely congregation as Sarah Beth Williams prepared to become Sarah Beth Henderson. The bride wore a simple blue dress that accommodated her now prominently pregnant figure, while the groom stood at the altar in a new black suit with his federal marshal's badge gleaming on his vest. Judge Morrison had agreed to perform the ceremony, while Colonel Bradley and Dr. Reeves served as witnesses. The church pews were filled with an eclectic mix of cavalry officers, local townspeople, and even some of the reformed outlaws Cole had helped capture during his brief but effective campaign against Dutch Pemberton's criminal network. Dearly beloved, Judge Morrison began, his voice carrying the same authority that had transformed Cole's legal nightmare into vindication. We are gathered here today to witness something that proves the American frontier's greatest strength: ability of good people to find each other and build something better than what they started with. Sarah Beth looked into Cole's eyes and saw the man who had traveled from near death in the desert to this moment of profound commitment. His face had filled out from their weeks of regular meals and relative safety, but more importantly, the haunted look that had marked him when she first found him had been replaced by something she could only call peace. The past 6 weeks had been extraordinary. Cole's appointment as a federal marshal had given him authority and resources to pursue Pemberton's gang systematically. But instead of the violent confrontations everyone expected, Cole had used his knowledge of criminal behavior and his reputation for fairness to convince several gang members to surrender voluntarily. "The way I see it," Cole had explained to Sarah Beth after bringing in his third prisoner without firing a shot, "most of these men aren't evil, they're desperate. Give them a choice between hanging with Dutch or having a chance at redemption, and they'll make the smart decision." His approach had shocked the territory. Federal marshals were expected to be hard men who solved problems with guns and ropes. Cole Henderson had proven that sometimes the most effective law enforcement came from understanding people rather than simply hunting them down. "Sarah Beth Williams," Judge Morrison continued, "do you take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, as long as you both shall live?" "I do," Sarah Beth replied, her voice strong and clear. She meant it more completely than she had ever meant anything in her life. "Cole Henderson, do you take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to love, honor, and cherish in good times, and in bad for as long as you both shall live?" "I do," Cole said, and Sarah Beth heard in his voice not just love, but gratitude for the second chance she had given him when she stopped in that desert to help a dying stranger. As they exchanged rings, simple gold bands purchased with Cole's federal salary, Sarah Beth reflected on how far they had both traveled. Not just the physical distance from New Mexico to Arizona, but the emotional journey from desperation to hope, from survival to love. The ceremony concluded with Judge Morrison's declaration, "By the authority vested in me by the territory of Arizona and the federal government of the United States, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Cole, you may kiss your bride." The kiss that followed was gentle, but filled with promise. As their lips met, Sarah Beth felt the baby kick vigorously, as if celebrating the moment. Cole felt it too, and broke the kiss with a laugh of pure joy. "Someone's excited about the wedding," he said, placing his hand on her belly. "Someone knows their father when they hear him," Sarah Beth replied, using the word deliberately. Cole's eyes filled with tears at hearing himself called father for the first time. The wedding reception was held in the church hall, a modest affair that reflected their circumstances, but overflowed with genuine celebration. Colonel Bradley offered a toast that captured the sentiment of everyone present, "To Marshal and Mrs. Henderson, who have proven that the frontier's greatest resource isn't gold or silver or cattle, but the courage of good people who refuse to give up on each other." As the evening progressed, Sarah Beth found herself surrounded by well-wishers and friends, people who had become part of their story during the past weeks. Dr. Reeves had agreed to stay in Tucson until the baby was born, while Judge Morrison had arranged for Cole to be stationed permanently in the area, giving them the stability they needed to build a life together. "Mrs. Henderson," said a familiar voice behind her. Sarah Beth turned to see Buck Carlisle, the man whose false testimony had nearly destroyed Cole's life. He stood hat in hand, his face showing genuine remorse. "Mr. Carlisle," Sarah Beth replied carefully. Cole had told her that Carlisle had voluntarily recanted his testimony and provided evidence against Pemberton, but she wasn't sure how to feel about the man who had almost sent her husband to prison. "I wanted to apologize," Carlisle said quietly, "for what I did, for the lies I told. Dutch Pemberton, he can be very persuasive when he wants something." "He threatened you," Sarah Beth said, understanding. "Threatened me, my family, offered money we desperately needed." Carlisle looked down at his hands. "That doesn't excuse what I did, but I wanted you to know that I'm grateful your husband gave me a chance to make it right. That's Cole's way," Sarah Beth replied. "He believes people can change if they're given the opportunity." As the evening wound down, Cole and Sarah Beth found themselves alone on the church steps, looking out at the desert that had brought them together. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that reminded Sarah Beth of the sketches Cole still drew in his notebook. "Do you ever regret it?" Cole asked suddenly. "Stopping for me that day? Everything that's happened since?" Sarah Beth considered the question seriously. The danger, the fear, the uncertainty. "I wouldn't wish that on anyone." She paused, placing her hand over his belly. "But the love, the partnership, the family we're building? I'd make the same choice 1,000 times over." Cole pulled her closer, careful of her pregnancy. "I never believed I deserved happiness," he admitted. "Thought my past had earned me a life of solitude and regret. Maybe that's the real miracle." Sarah Beth said softly, "Not that we found each other, but that we both learned we were worthy of being found." Their quiet moment was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. Cole instinctively moved to put himself between Sarah Beth and the potential threat, his hand moving toward his gun. But the riders who emerged from the darkness weren't outlaws or enemies. They were a family of settlers whose wagon had broken down on the desert road. "Marshall Henderson?" called the man leading the group. "We heard you might be able to help." "U.S. Our wagon's lost a wheel, and we've got children and no supplies for camping in the desert." Cole looked at Sarah Beth, who smiled and nodded. Some things never changed. People in trouble needed help, and they were the kind of people who provided it. "Of course," Cole replied. "Let me get my tools." As Cole organized a rescue effort for the stranded family, Sarah Beth watched with pride and love. This was who Cole Henderson really was, not the gunfighter or the lawman or the man haunted by his past, but simply a good person who helped when help was needed. 3 hours later, they had the settler's wagon repaired and the family safely on their way to town. As Cole and Sarah Beth finally returned to their small rented house near the marshal's office, she felt the first unmistakable signs that their baby was ready to be born. "Cole," she said calmly, gripping his arm as a contraction swept through her. "What is it?" He looked at her face and immediately understood. "The baby. It's time." The next several hours blurred together in a haze of activity and anticipation. Dr. Reeves took charge with professional competence, while Cole paced the small living room like a caged animal, stopping only when Sarah Beth called for him during the most difficult moments. As dawn broke over Tucson, their son entered the world with a healthy cry that announced his arrival to the entire neighborhood. Cole was allowed into the bedroom just as Dr. Reeves finished cleaning and wrapping the baby. "Meet your son," Dr. Reeves said, placing the infant in Sarah Beth's arms. Cole approached the bed with reverent steps, his face full of wonder as he looked at the tiny person they had created together. The baby had Sarah Beth's delicate features, but Cole's determined chin, and when he opened his eyes, they were the same pale blue as his father's. "What should we call him?" Cole asked softly. Sarah Beth had been thinking about this for weeks. "Samuel," she said. "After my first husband, who would have wanted this baby to have the best father possible." Cole's eyes filled with tears at the generosity of her choice. "Samuel Henderson," he said, testing the name. "I like it." As the days passed and they settled into the rhythms of new parenthood, word of their story began to spread throughout the territory. The pregnant widow who had saved a dying cowboy, the reformed gunfighter who had become a marshal dedicated to justice rather than vengeance, the love story that had begun with an act of mercy in the desert. It captured people's imagination in a way that surprised them both. Letters arrived from as far away as San Francisco and Denver, from people who had heard their story and been inspired by it. A newspaper reporter came from Phoenix, wanting to write about the miracle marshal who had reformed an entire gang of outlaws without firing a shot. "I don't understand all the fuss," Cole said one evening as they sat on their porch, watching Samuel sleep in his mother's arms. "We just did what needed doing." "That's exactly why people are interested," Sarah Beth replied. "In a time when so much seems dark and violent, you've shown that there's another way. That strength doesn't always mean force. that justice doesn't require vengeance. 6 months later, Cole received an offer that would have seemed impossible. During their desperate journey across the desert, the governor of Arizona Territory wanted him to become the territorial marshal, with authority over law enforcement across the entire region. It would mean traveling, Cole said as they discussed the opportunity, being away from home for weeks at a time. It would also mean helping more people, Sarah Beth replied. Building the kind of law enforcement the territory needs: fair, honest, focused on protecting people rather than just punishing criminals. Cole looked at his son, now sitting up and reaching for everything within his grasp. Then at his wife, who had given him not just love but purpose. "What do you think?" "Samuel," he asked the baby seriously, "should your father take a job that might change the entire territory?" Samuel responded by laughing and reaching for Cole's badge, his tiny fingers grasping the symbol of his father's transformation from outlaw hunter to protector of justice. "I think that's a yes," Sarah Beth said with a smile as Cole accepted the appointment, and they prepared for the larger challenges that lay ahead. Sarah Beth often thought about that moment in the desert when she had first seen a dying man and made the choice to stop. At the time, it had seemed like a simple decision: help someone in need and accept the consequences. She could never have imagined that those consequences would include love, marriage, a child, and a partnership that would transform not just their lives but the very nature of law enforcement in the American Southwest. The desert had tested them. Enemies had pursued them, and circumstances had threatened to destroy them. But they had survived and thrived because they had learned the most important lesson the frontier could teach: that true strength comes not from standing alone, but from choosing to stand together. Years later, when historians wrote about the transformation of the Arizona Territory from a lawless frontier to a place where justice and mercy worked hand in hand, they would point to Marshal Cole Henderson and his family as the catalyst for that change. But Sarah Beth always knew the real story was simpler and more profound than any history book could capture. It was the story of two broken people who had found each other in the vast emptiness and chosen to build something beautiful from the fragments of their shattered lives. The wagon that had carried them across the desert was long gone, replaced by a comfortable home and stable life. But the journey that had begun with an act of mercy in the wilderness continued every day as they worked together to prove that love, justice, and hope were stronger than any force the frontier could conjure against them. In the end, what shocked the territory wasn't just what Cole Henderson did after Sarah Beth found him dying in the desert. It was what they did together, transforming not just themselves, but everyone around them, proving that sometimes the most unlikely beginnings lead to the most extraordinary endings. 5 years had passed since that fateful day in the desert, when Sarah Beth Williams found a dying man and changed both their destinies forever. The small ranch house outside Tucson bore little resemblance to the desperate circumstances that had brought its owners together, yet the values forged in those harsh early days remained the foundation of everything they had built. Marshal Cole Henderson stood on his front porch in the pre-dawn darkness, watching the sunrise paint the Catalina Mountains in shades of gold and crimson. At 38, he had grown into his authority with a quiet confidence that commanded respect throughout the territory. His badge still gleamed on his vest, but the man who wore it had evolved far beyond the haunted gunfighter Sarah Beth had rescued. Behind him, the sounds of family life drifted through the open windows. 5-year-old Samuel was helping his mother prepare breakfast, his chatter filling the kitchen with the innocent joy that Cole still marveled at experiencing. Their daughter, 3-year-old Emma, named after Cole's long-dead grandmother, was likely hiding somewhere in the house, playing one of her elaborate games of imagination. "Papa, come see," Samuel's voice called from inside. "I drew the story again." Cole smiled, knowing exactly which story his son meant. Samuel had become fascinated with the tale of how his parents met, asking to hear it repeatedly and creating elaborate drawings that depicted a pregnant woman finding a man in the desert. The child's artistic talent clearly came from Cole's side of the family. Though his sunny disposition was pure Sarah Beth. Inside, Cole found Samuel standing proudly beside a new sketch tacked to the kitchen wall. This one showed a wagon, too. Stick figures, and what might have been mountains or storm clouds in the background. The attention to detail was remarkable for a 5-year-old. "That's wonderful, son," Cole said, kneeling to examine the drawing more closely. "You've captured the moment perfectly." "Tell me again about the desert," Samuel demanded, settling into Cole's lap with the confidence of a child who had never doubted his place in the world. Sarah Beth looked up from the stove, her face showing the contentment of a woman who had found her place in life. At 29, she had grown into her role as a marshal's wife and mother with grace and strength. The pregnancy weight had never fully disappeared, but it suited her, giving her a maternal softness that complemented her inner steel. "Your father has to leave for Phoenix today," she reminded Samuel. "The territorial governor wants to discuss expanding the Marshall program." Cole nodded, though he felt the familiar reluctance that came with leaving his family. His work as territorial Marshall had proven so successful that other Western territories were requesting his advice on law enforcement reform. What had begun as a personal journey of redemption had evolved into a movement that was reshaping frontier justice across the American West. "Tell me quickly," Samuel insisted. "Just the best part." Cole settled back in his chair, Emma climbing onto his other knee as she heard the beginning of her favorite story. "Well, your mama was traveling to California, and she was very brave but also very scared." As he recounted the familiar tale, Cole marveled at how the story had taken on a life of its own. Newspapers across the country had written about the Mercy Marshal and his wife, turning their personal struggle into a symbol of frontier redemption. Books had been written, though most took considerable liberties with the facts. A traveling theater company had even performed a dramatic version in Denver, complete with elaborate desert scenery and a melodramatic villain clearly based on Dutch Pemberton. "And then Mama stopped the wagon," Samuel continued, knowing his part in the storytelling ritual. "That's right," Cole confirmed. "Even though it was dangerous, even though she barely had enough supplies for herself, your mother chose to help a stranger. That choice changed everything." The story concluded with Samuel and Emma racing off to play, leaving Cole and Sarah Beth alone in the kitchen. She poured him coffee and sat across from him at the table they had built together in their 2nd year of marriage. "How long will you be gone this time?" she asked. 2 weeks, possibly 3. Governor Morrison wants me to review the entire territorial justice system, make recommendations for improvement." Cole reached across the table to take her hand. "I'm sorry. I know these trips are hard on you." "The children miss you," Sarah Beth said simply. "And so do I, but I understand why this work matters." Cole studied his wife's face, seeing something there that concerned him. "There's something else. What is it?" Sarah Beth was quiet for a moment, then smiled with the expression she wore when she had news to share. "Dr. Martinez confirmed it yesterday. We're having another baby." Cole felt his world tilt with joy and surprise. Another baby? When? Early spring by her calculations. Sarah Beth's hand moved instinctively to her still flat stomach. "I wanted to tell you before you left for Phoenix." Cole stood and pulled her into his arms, spinning her on the kitchen despite her laughing protests about disturbing the children. At 43, Sarah Beth had told him she thought their family was complete, but the news of another child filled him with the same wonder he had felt when Samuel was born. "Are you happy?" she asked, searching his face. "Happy doesn't begin to cover it," Cole replied, kissing her forehead. "Amazed, grateful, terrified, excited, but mostly just grateful that we get to do this again." The conversation was interrupted by a knock at the front door. Cole opened it to find Deputy Marshal Jake Sullivan, a young man he had personally trained, and who now served as his second-in-command in the territorial office. "Morning, Marshal," Sullivan said, tipping his hat to Sarah Beth. "Sorry to interrupt, but we've got a situation that requires your attention before you leave for Phoenix." "What kind of situation?" Cole asked, already reaching for his gun belt. "Remember that gang of cattle rustlers operating near the Mexican border? The ones who've been hitting ranches around Nogales?" Sullivan's expression was grim. "They took hostages during their last raid. A family traveling through father, mother, and 2 young children." Cole felt his jaw tighten. Despite 5 years of success in reforming territorial law enforcement, there were still those who chose violence over cooperation. The taking of innocent hostages crossed every line Cole held sacred. "What do we know about their location?" "Tracking suggests they're holed up in the old Apache stronghold in the Dragoon Mountains. It's rough country, easy to defend, hard to assault without risking the hostages." Sullivan paused. "The local sheriff is talking about organizing a posse." "Storming the place?" "Absolutely not," Cole said immediately. "That's exactly how innocent people get killed." He turned to Sarah Beth. "I'm sorry, but I have to go," she said firmly. "Those children need you more than the governor does right now." Cole kissed her goodbye, holding her perhaps a moment longer than usual. The irony wasn't lost on him that he was leaving his pregnant wife to rescue another family in danger, but Sarah Beth understood the demands of his position better than anyone. "Be careful," she said quietly. "Come home to us." "Always," Cole promised. 2 hours later, Cole and a carefully selected team of 6 deputies were riding toward the Dragoon Mountains. Instead of the large, heavily armed posse that traditional law enforcement would have organized, Cole had chosen men known for their patience, marksmanship, and ability to think before shooting. "What's the plan, Marshal?" asked Deputy Rodriguez, a former Vasiro whose knowledge of desert terrain was invaluable. "Same as always," Cole replied. "We talk first, fight only if we have to, and everybody goes home alive if possible." As they rode, Cole reflected on how his approach to law enforcement had evolved. The young gunfighter who had once solved problems with violence now understood that most conflicts could be resolved through patience, understanding, and offering people better choices than the ones they were making. The Dragoon Mountains had been Apache territory for generations before becoming a haven for outlaws and fugitives. The natural fortress of rock formations and hidden canyons made it nearly impossible to assault directly. But Cole had learned that sometimes the most effective approach was the most unexpected one. Instead of surrounding the rustlers' position and demanding surrender, Cole rode alone up the main trail toward their camp, his hands visible and his gun holstered. His deputies remained hidden in positions that would allow them to provide support if negotiations failed, but the initial contact would be one man talking to other men. "Hello, the camp," Cole called when he was within shouting distance. "I'm Marshal Henderson. I'd like to talk." A voice called back from the rocks above. "Nothing to talk about, lawman. We got hostages, and we ain't afraid to use them." "I know," Cole replied calmly. "That's exactly what I want to discuss. Mind if I come up? I'm not looking for a fight." There was a long pause, followed by whispered consultation among the rustlers. Finally, the same voice called down, "Come ahead. But keep your hands where we can see them." Cole climbed the rocky trail slowly, his movements deliberate and non-threatening. As he crested the ridge, he saw the rustlers' camp spread before him, a dozen men in a defensive position with 4 civilians huddled near a campfire. The hostages appeared to be unharmed but terrified. The rustlers' leader was a man in his 40s with graying hair and the weathered face of someone who had spent his life on the wrong side of the law. He held a rifle but didn't point it directly at Cole. "You got some brass coming up here alone, Marshal," the leader said. "Name's Tom Briggs. Maybe you heard of me." Cole had indeed heard of Tom Briggs, a career criminal who had been rustling cattle across 3 territories for the better part of a decade. But as he studied the man's face, Cole saw something that gave him hope: exhaustion, desperation, and perhaps a desire for a way out of the life he had chosen. "I've heard of you, Mr. Briggs," Cole said respectfully, "and I know you're in a difficult situation. But I'm here to offer you something better than a shootout that gets people killed." "What kind of offer?" Briggs asked suspiciously. "Safe passage to Mexico for you and your men, in exchange for releasing the hostages unharmed." Cole kept his voice calm and reasonable. "No pursuit, no bounty hunters. Just a chance to start over somewhere else." The offer surprised everyone in the camp, including some of Cole's own hidden deputies, who were listening through field glasses from their concealed positions. Traditional law enforcement didn't negotiate with criminals, especially those who took hostages. "Why would you do that?" Briggs asked, confusion evident in his voice. "Because those hostages have done nothing wrong, and they don't deserve to die for your problems," Cole replied honestly. "And because I believe men can change if they're given the chance." What followed was a tense negotiation that lasted nearly 2 hours. Cole listened to Briggs' story, a Civil War veteran who had lost his farm to carpetbaggers, turned to rustling out of desperation, and found himself trapped in a life of crime that offered no hope of redemption. "I got men depending on me," Briggs said at one point. "Some of them got families in Mexico, children who need their fathers." "Then be the kind of father they can be proud of," Cole suggested. "Take the deal, cross the border, and build something legitimate. The war's been over for 20 years, Tom. Time to stop fighting it." In the end, it was the simplest argument that convinced Briggs: Cole's genuine belief that people deserved second chances, even when they had made terrible choices. The rustler leader looked at the terrified family they were holding hostage and saw his own grandchildren in their faces. "All right, Marshal," Briggs said finally. "We'll take your deal. But if this is some kind of trick—" "No tricks," Cole promised. "You have my word as a federal officer and as a man who understands what it means to need a second chance." The hostage exchange proceeded smoothly. The family was released unharmed, while Cole personally escorted the rustlers to the Mexican border and watched them cross. Some of his deputies questioned the wisdom of letting known criminals escape justice, but Cole had learned that sometimes mercy accomplished more than punishment. "You think they'll really go straight?" Deputy Sullivan asked as they rode back toward Tucson. "Some will, some won't," Cole replied honestly. "But that family is alive and safe, and Tom Briggs has a chance to be something other than an outlaw for the rest of his life. Sometimes that's the best outcome you can hope for." 2 weeks later, Cole returned from his meetings in Phoenix with authorization to expand his reform program throughout the Western Territories. The territorial governor had been so impressed with Cole's methods that he wanted them implemented from Colorado to California. But the news that greeted him at home was far more important than any professional recognition. Sarah Beth was waiting on the porch with Samuel and Emma, her face glowing with happiness and health. "How did the meetings go?" she asked as he swept her into his arms. "Well enough," Cole replied. "But tell me about you, about the baby. Everything's all right?" "Everything's perfect," Sarah Beth assured him. "Dr. Martinez says this pregnancy is progressing even better than the others." That evening, as they sat together on their porch watching the sunset, Cole reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. The desperate man dying in the desert seemed like a character from someone else's story. So completely had his life been transformed. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't stopped that day?" he asked Sarah Beth. "Never," she replied without hesitation. "Some choices are so right that wondering about alternatives is pointless." She placed his hand on her belly, where the new life was growing. "This is where we were meant to be, who we were meant to become." As if to emphasize her point, the baby kicked strongly under Cole's palm. He felt the same sense of wonder and responsibility that had marked the births of Samuel and Emma, but also something deeper, a profound gratitude for the second chance that had allowed him to become the man, husband, and father he was today. "I love you, Sarah Beth Henderson," he said quietly. "I love you too, Cole Henderson," she replied. "All of you, the man you were, the man you became, and the man you're still becoming." The desert that had nearly killed them both now stretched peacefully before their home, no longer a place of desperation, but a reminder of how far they had traveled together. In the distance, the lights of Tucson twinkled like earthbound stars, marking the community that had been transformed by their example of mercy, justice, and the power of choosing hope over fear. Their story had become legend, but the reality was simpler and more profound than any legend could capture. Two broken people had found each other in the wilderness and chosen to build something beautiful from the fragments of their shattered lives. And in doing so, they had proven that sometimes the most unlikely rescues lead to the most extraordinary destinies. 20-5 years after that fateful day in the New Mexico desert, an elderly woman sat in a rocking chair on the porch of a grand house overlooking the city of Tucson. Sarah Beth Henderson, now 54, watched her grandchildren play in the yard while her son Samuel, now 30 and a respected lawyer, read aloud from a letter that had arrived that morning from Washington, D.C. "Mother," Samuel said, looking up from the official document, "they want to name the new federal law enforcement academy after Father." Sarah Beth smiled, her weathered hands folding the quilt she had been mending. "Your father would have found that amusing. He always said the best law enforcement was the kind nobody noticed, because it prevented problems instead of just solving them." Cole Henderson had passed away the previous winter, not from violence or the dangers of his profession, but peacefully in his sleep at the age of 68. His death had prompted an outpouring of tributes from across the American West, as communities remembered the marshal who had transformed frontier justice through patience, mercy, and an unwavering belief in human redemption. Emma, now 28 and a teacher at the new Tucson Academy for Young Women, looked up from where she was helping her youngest brother Michael with his arithmetic. "Tell them about the last case, Mama, the one that made all the newspapers." Sarah Beth's eyes grew distant as she remembered Cole's final investigation, a case that had seemed to encapsulate everything he had learned about justice and mercy over his 25-year career as a federal marshal. It had involved a notorious outlaw named Black Jack Morrison, whose gang had terrorized mining camps throughout Colorado and New Mexico for 3 years. When Morrison was finally captured after a bank robbery gone wrong, the territorial authorities wanted him hanged immediately. Public sentiment demanded blood, and newspapers called for swift frontier justice, but Cole had insisted on investigating Morrison's background, discovering that the man was a former Union Army sergeant who had lost his wife and children to a cholera epidemic while he was serving overseas. Driven mad by grief and guilt, Morrison had turned to violence as a way of punishing a world that had taken everything from him. Instead of simply processing Morrison for execution, Cole had spent hours talking with the condemned man, slowly helping him confront the pain that had driven him to crime. The breakthrough came when Morrison broke down and admitted that he had been trying to die for years, hoping someone would finally put him out of his misery. "That's when your father made his decision," Sarah Beth told her gathered family. "He convinced the judge to commute Morrison's sentence to life in prison, but with the condition that Morrison would work with other troubled veterans, helping them find alternatives to violence." Samuel shook his head in admiration. Even at the end, he was finding ways to save people instead of just punishing them. The program Cole had established with Black Jack, Morrison had become a model for veteran rehabilitation throughout the territories. Morrison himself had become one of its most effective counselors, using his own story of redemption to help other broken men find their way back to productive lives. The newspaper called it the Henderson Method, Emma added. They said Father had proven that even the most hardened criminals could be reformed if someone cared enough to try. Sarah Beth nodded, remembering the pride in Cole's eyes when the first veteran successfully completed the program and found honest work. Her husband had understood something that most lawmen never learned, that true justice wasn't about punishment, but about healing the wounds that drove people to commit crimes in the first place. Young Michael, now 16 and the image of his father at that age, looked up from his books. "Mama, tell us about the desert again. The real story, not the one in the newspapers." Sarah Beth smiled at her youngest child, born when she was 38, and thought her family was complete. Michael had inherited his father's artistic talent and his mother's stubborn compassion, already talking about becoming a doctor to help people in remote frontier communities. "The real story," Sarah Beth said slowly, "isn't about heroes or villains, or dramatic rescues. It's about a moment when two broken people chose hope over despair." She closed her eyes, remembering that scorching day when she had seen a figure lying motionless beside a dead horse. "I almost didn't stop. I was scared, pregnant, running from creditors and a town that saw me as a burden. Stopping for a stranger seemed like the kind of mistake that could get us both killed." "But you did stop," Samuel said gently. "Because I realized that the kind of person I wanted to be was the kind who stopped," Sarah Beth replied. "Your father taught me later that courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about doing the right thing even when you're terrified." As the afternoon wore on, more family members arrived for their weekly gathering. Emma's husband brought their 2 young daughters, while Samuel's wife Margaret came with their infant son. The house filled with the sounds of multiple generations, all of whom owed their existence to a decision made in desperation 25 years earlier. Dr. Amanda Reeves, now retired but still sharp at 71, arrived with a special gift, a leather-bound journal that Cole had kept throughout his career as a federal marshal. She had found it while helping Sarah Beth organize his papers for donation to the Territorial Archives. "I thought you should have this," Dr. Reeves said, presenting the journal to Sarah Beth. "It contains his thoughts about every major case, but also his reflections on your family and what you meant to him." Sarah Beth opened the journal with trembling hands, finding page after page of Cole's careful handwriting. The entries chronicled his evolution from a haunted gunfighter to a thoughtful lawman, but they also revealed the depth of his love for his family and his gratitude for the second chance Sarah Beth had given him. One entry, dated shortly after Michael's birth, brought tears to her eyes. "Held my youngest son today and marveled at the miracle of his existence. Not just his life, but the chain of events that made it possible." If Sarah Beth had ridden past that day in the desert, none of this would exist. Not our love, not our children, not the work we've done together to make this territory a better place. One act of mercy created an entire universe of possibilities. Another entry, written during his final case, showed how completely Cole had embraced his philosophy of redemptive justice. "Spoke with Black Jack Morrison again today. Saw in his eyes the same desperation I once carried. Convinced now that every man deserves what Sarah Beth gave me, a chance to become something better than what his pain has made him." This is the real work of law enforcement, not just maintaining order, but creating the conditions where people can choose order for themselves. As Sarah Beth read aloud from the journal, her family listened in reverent silence. These weren't the dramatic adventures that newspaper reporters love to embellish, but the quiet reflections of a man who had dedicated his life to proving that mercy was stronger than violence. The final entry, written just weeks before Cole's death, seemed to summarize everything he had learned. "Sarah Beth asked me today what I want to be remembered for. The newspapers will remember the cases, the criminals captured, the reforms implemented. But I want to be remembered for something simpler. I want to be remembered as a man who learned that saving one person can save the world. Because that person goes on to save others, and those others save still more, until mercy becomes a river that transforms everything it touches. As the sun set behind the Catalina Mountains, painting the sky in the same gold and crimson hues that had marked so many evenings of their life together, Sarah Beth felt the presence of her husband as strongly as if he were sitting beside her. On the porch, Samuel stood and raised a glass of lemonade in toast. "To Cole Henderson," he said solemnly, "who proved that the greatest strength is knowing when not to use it." "To Cole Henderson," the family echoed, but Sarah Beth added her own words. "To the man who taught us that love is the only force powerful enough to transform hate, and that mercy is the only justice that truly heals." As the stars emerged over the desert that had brought them together, Sarah Beth understood that their story was ending exactly as it should, not with dramatic conclusions or final confrontations, but with the quiet satisfaction of a life well lived, and a love that had created ripples of goodness extending far beyond their ability to measure. The newspapers would write their obituaries, historians would analyze their impact, and future generations would study the Henderson method of law enforcement. But the real legacy wasn't in any official record. It was in the children who grew up believing that people could change, in the communities that chose talking over shooting, in the countless small acts of mercy that had been inspired by their IV example. It was in the understanding that sometimes the most important thing a person can do is stop when someone needs help, even when stopping seems impossible. The desert stretched beyond their porch, still vast and unforgiving, but no longer empty. It was filled with the echoes of every life their mercy had touched, every second chance they had made possible, every proof that love was indeed stronger than fear. And in that desert, carried on the evening wind, was the whisper of a truth that would outlive them all, that the choice to save one stranger can indeed save the world, one heart at a time. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.